And welcome to another vlog from the oldnorthstatepolitics.com. I'm Michael Bitzer of Catawba College, and again, I'm thrilled to have my distinguished colleagues and friends of the blog with us today for our first 2021 vlog, otherwise known as 2020 version 2.1, apparently, for the past 3 weeks worth of news in this new year. Joining us, of course, is Dr. Whitney Ross Manzo of Meredith College, Dr. Chris Cooper of Western Carolina University, and Dr. Susan Roberts of Davidson College. We've certainly got a lot to consider and talk about, but I think with the start of the new administration and the new relationships that may or may not be poised here in the next couple of weeks for Biden and for Congress, I kind of wanted to start off with maybe a big picture perspective. And Susan, I'll start with you because you certainly teach Congress and the presidency. What are your thoughts about how the Biden administration and Joe Biden's relationship with so many senators, how is that relationship, do you think, going to play out between now the executive branch and the legislative branch, particularly with the Senate being so closely divided and the dynamics in that chamber?
Well, and I don't want to start out talking about ageism, but McConnell and Biden have had a relationship for 36 years. Other important numbers. The average age of a senator is about 61 or 62, and for a House member is 56. So some of these people have been around the block. We have newcomers, Ossoff and AOC and things, but I think these are people that have been tested. One of the things I think Biden is going to have to do is maybe not wear his politics on his sleeve and be a little more strategic like Mitch McConnell. I do think, when we talk to our students, and I think all of you would agree, we try to talk about how do we measure success? I mean, is it just really legislative productivity? Is it going to lunch with one another? Is it the Boehner-Obama? If you saddle up and go over to the White House, you're going to get in trouble. But I think some of it's going to come in. If I were to say one thing about, especially the Senate, there has to be some communication. It's a process thing now. And that will go a long way in helping. What else determines Biden and McConnell and the House is the size of the agenda. And, I think Biden has a huge agenda, and rightly so. So I think the size of the agenda, the consultation, and let me say this one thing. John Kyle, a former senator from a Republican from Arizona, said he thought, and I wish this would be the case, I hope it's the case, that he thought Biden and his staff and McConnell and his staff could, quote, negotiate in good faith, end quote. Wouldn't that be lovely?
It would be a refreshing take. One person that you didn't mention that I found really interesting, where's Chuck Schumer in all of this? Where do you think the Senate Democratic leader, now the majority leader by one vote, granted, is going to be in all of this?
I think it's going to take him, in my personal opinion, a little time to kind of rub McConnell's face in it a little bit, because he's been waiting for this for a long time. Reid's gone, McConnell's now in the minority. But I think he's going to be, Chuck Schumer, this is a given, but is not Nancy Pelosi. And so I think there may be this whole thing, and we don't want to get into the weeds, but this whole thing about an organizing resolution. And some of these may be just, a little bit sparring at the beginning to kind of lay down the gauntlet and say, this is what's going to happen, maybe. So I think Schumer's going to be a little more cooperative than Pelosi will. But I want to work this in case I forget it later. I read a headline just a few moments ago, and I got it written down. It says, legal issues are political in Trump impeachment trial. I thought, dog bites man. If I had a student that wrote that I would say, you got to be kidding me. So, it's going to be challenging again with the impeachment coming up, and I don't think it could be any more dramatic and consequential.
Well, we're taping this on Tuesday, January 26th, and all of my colleagues may or may not know this. The Senate just voted down a move by Rand Paul to raise a point of constitutional order against the impeachment process because Donald Trump is no longer president. And so he was trying to utilize a point of order, and Chuck Schumer moved to lay it on the table, and the vote was 55 to 45. So meaning it had to be 5 Republicans voting with all 50 Democrats and the 2 independents to table the motion to basically kill Rand Paul's attempt to stop the impeachment process. Chris, what does that say, though, if you need 67 votes to convict in this Senate? Is the numbers just going to be the dynamic of what we should be watching, as Susan said, in terms of the Senate process?
I think that's exactly right. I think, that's a big number. I don't think anybody thinks we will likely get to that number. I think Susan said so many smart things there. I think the early sparring that we saw over even whether the Democrats should be allowed to have the gavel and how committee assignment should work showed us that this isn't going to be an easy transition, right? It's not that Donald Trump is gone, Joe Biden has come, and everybody's going to hold hands and sing Kumbaya, and we're going to have this Senate to function the way that it used to. I think hyperpartisanship is there to stay in the Senate. What I kind of hope is that although the hyperpartisanship will stay, that we'll lose some of the kind of no holds bar politics that doesn't always have to go with hyperpartisanship, right? So just because you have 2 people who are on polar opposites, polarized extremes, doesn't mean that they have to ignore regular order and they have to blow up the norms of democracy. So I think Susan's point is such a good one about how do we judge success. I think my judge of success won't be a whole lot of bipartisan bills, because I think that's just not going to happen. But something approaching regular order, polarized politics, yes, maybe polarized politics that aren't quite so nasty.
Whitney, how do you see success between the executive branch and the legislative branch coming up in the next couple of months?
To be perfectly honest, I'd be happy if we just had like a budget without any government shutdowns. I think that could be considered a success, considering how many continuing resolutions and shutdowns we had to face during the Trump administration. And I think the budget point is important too, because even though a lot of non-political scientists sneer at the idea of log rolling and vote trading, that's actually how politics works in the Congress. And so if that's what it takes for them, you get your bridge to nowhere and I get my, extra military base or whatever. If we end up with a budget for the whole country and the government doesn't shut down, I still call that a success. Because that's part of, their job is to represent their constituents. One thing that I teach my students often is Congress is in a prisoner's dilemma all the time, because each one of them is playing a game of who can get what out of each other. And even though total cooperation would be beneficial for America, there's no real overarching boss to force cooperation. There's nobody in Congress whose role it is to look out for the entire United States. So expecting that of them is kind of expecting unrealistic things. And so if we could just get them even a couple of bills, one of which is a budget, I would call that a success, because it would be more than they've done for the last 4 years.
And that raises an interesting point. The prisoner's dilemma, the fact of, what do you want here? I can switch that. I can switch that. There's also the option, and I think we saw this within the first couple of hours of his taking the administration over. Biden's very willing to sign a plethora of executive orders and just decide, maybe I'll just go it on my own. If he can't get anything done with Congress, Whitney, do you think he'll resort to just executive fiats that we've seen in the past?
Yeah, I mean, it's been hard this is what I do for a living, and it's been hard for me to keep up with all of the executive orders. Like the fact I showed my husband the picture of that first day, all of the stack he had next to him. It's honestly ridiculous. This executive orders are not in the Constitution. They are something that every president has done, starting to become much more common with FDR. So I'm not trying to like bag on Biden for using executive orders like it's a new thing. It's not. But I think that governing by fiat with an executive order is actually one of the examples of democratic backsliding. When you have an executive who gains more and more power to themselves and takes it away from the legislature and the courts and the media, then you have a problem where it's a less democratic outcome. The whole reason we have Congress and the whole reason the founding fathers wanted the legislature to be the primary actor in government is they're supposed to be reflecting everyone in the United States. And while Joe Biden did win the popular vote and the Electoral College, he still is not representing everyone in the United States because he's a Democrat. And in an era of hyperpartisanship, all of his statements about I want to represent all Americans doesn't make it so. And so, there are people who want to be represented by Republicans, and those people should get their voices heard. That's the point of a democracy. And so I do think that, even if I personally think some of his executive orders are good ideas, I think it's a problem for there to be, well, the Congress isn't working, so I'm just going to do everything by executive order, because that just grows the presidency even more. And then the next president will grow it even more until do we even have a legislature?
And Susan, what happens to checks and balances? I mean, what happens to separate institutions supposedly sharing power?
I think that may be a thing of the past, but I would say, following up on what Whitney says, is that right now, at least, Biden is undoing the Trump executive orders, or that's what he's trying to do. So whether he goes further than that, but one of the executive orders from Trump was, if you add one regulation, you have to get rid of two. That is totally silly. I mean, that is just content free. But one thing I think might happen with Congress and the presidency and separation of powers, is that you're going to have some consensus that you might say, we're not going to say bipartisanship. It's going to be more cherry picking. You're going to get one or two votes. You're not going to get, like the emergency coalition, which I would have thought we might have had something close to that. The post 9/11 emergency coalition, everybody pretty much in. I think it's going to require a lot of cooperation. And that's where I think Joe Biden, in a way, his personality and his predilection for saying unity might take us a little further. I don't know that it's going to be easy, but you've got to keep hoping, as Whitney says, and Chris, about something to be a little better, to get back from with a budget, and could we at least deliberate and not just a word even farther from debate? Could we just deliberate a little bit? And I think that's really, the bar is pretty high for that, but maybe we can get closer.
Chris, how do you see this playing out in terms of cooperation versus conflict? I mean, we've had this era of conflict based on, as you all have noted, hyper-partisanship. Are we going to get any cooperation?
I think we'll get some. I think I agree with everything that's been said, that if anybody can do it, it's probably Biden. And that's not that I think Biden is a master negotiator or, the best person who can be president necessarily. But I think he's somebody who understands how the United States Senate works, and he has relationships. And politics ultimately is still about relationships. And the fact that he can leverage those relationships sometimes, I think he's in the best position possible. With that said, I think we all need to be watching the ball on executive versus legislative power. I think the points about executive orders and how many are enough is a good one. And I do sometimes wonder if we're in an arms race. So, Whitney talked about how many Biden's had. I think Susan talked really well about how many of those were just reversing what Trump had done. Well, if we play this forward, maybe in 4 years or 8 years, when a Republican takes over again, are they then going to get everything Biden did and then have their own set of executive orders? Congress. So I think there's kind of that on the one hand. I do think it's important historically to point out that I think Jimmy Carter actually had the most post-World War II executive orders, and we had more, I think, pre-World War II than we actually have had recently. So it's a little bit of a kind of what do you compare us to? In the very recent history, yes, I think we're seeing a little bit of an increase compared to the long ago past. I think we're seeing something different. But I do hope that both institutions, the legislative branch and the executive branch, can start to think more like institutions. I think the more they're thinking like institutions and less like parties, the better off we are. And probably everybody in the Zoom room here has read Sean Theriot's book about Gingrich senators, where essentially he argues that when Newt Gingrich was in the House and that class of folks then moved to the Senate, and they brought almost the attitude of the House to the Senate. And I think kind of getting away from that and thinking more about the Senate as being the cooler branch of government, as the founders did intend, the better off we're going to be.
I'm curious. I'm going to just kind of softball this, and anybody who wants to pick it up. I'm teaching presidency this semester, and in my opening class, I talked about, how the presidency is an institution. It's a structure of government, but the institution is made up of individuals, as is Congress. And, so much of this dynamic is based on the relationship that Joe Biden has, particularly with somebody like Mitch McConnell. But I'm curious as to y'all's reaction. Could the Kingmaker really be somebody like Joe Manchin? Somebody like Lisa Murkowski? I mean, some of these folks, Mitt Romney even, some of these folks that, have the power to tip the scale one way or the other in a 50-50 split Senate.
Sure. I want to just mention one thing when you talk about teaching the presidency. I always talk about to my students the nexus between evaluating the presidency and studying the presidency. And that's a real curious dynamic. I think you look at some people, you look at the Jeff Flakes, you might look at people who have people that are retiring, or Murkowski, who don't have a lot to lose by venturing out and being, have a little bit of an olive branch. But I think, it is going to depend on a few. And I don't know yet who those Republicans were that went along and tabled the Rand Pauls. But I think there are some out there. And I think that that's not going to be easy to get. But I think that if you think in terms of the spirit, Joe Biden is probably the best one. Can you imagine Elizabeth Warren in this? And Biden he's calling for unity, also has to call for unity within his own party.
Yeah. Whitney, you want to add anything?
I just, when Chris was talking, I was thinking about the executive orders, undoing the executive orders, and how it could happen again. And that's actually where Susan's point or maybe it was you, Michael, about they're institutions, but they're also people. I don't know that the American people think of them that way. I think of them, they kind of view them as the institution. And when you have this swingy back and forth, I think that erodes trust in government because, why even lean on something because it'll just be undone, and, government can't make up its mind. And I mean, I also think about the poor bureaucratic workers who have to totally change course now. And that leads to inefficiencies, even if they try their best. I mean, I'm not saying that they're doing poorly at their job, but I mean, any of us would have a hard time totally changing course in 24 hours. And so I think that one of the struggles that we'll also face is just even more distrust in government, and how that works, along with people in the Senate who have kind of fanned some flames about conspiracy theories. I think those people could end up having a larger say than maybe we would hope that they would, because they can capitalize on that feeling that many Americans are expressing.
So folks like Josh Hawley, the Ted Cruz's, others,
Madison Cawthorn.
And Madison Cawthorn here in North Carolina. I mean, I think, certainly they are going to play their role as the flamethrowers, the bomb throwers, whatever you want to describe it. But it really feels, if Biden has to be working with different factions within his party, you've got the same dynamic playing out in the Republican Party as well, particularly with what seems to be a new assertive group of, Chris, you had talked about, and I immediately flashed back to Lindsey Graham going from the House to the Senate, kind of that kind of dynamic. But you've got a whole new set of anxious and antagonistic Republicans in the Republican conference now in the House. What's the future for the Republican Party in terms of, now that they don't control the White House, they don't have necessarily their party leader present as a president would be, but Donald Trump is still going to have an influence on this party, isn't he?
Absolutely. And I don't think anybody denies that, that's paying attention to American politics at all over the course of the last 4 years. There was a good piece that I'd recommend, and I'm sure everybody here's read it, but the Hans Noel piece in the Atlantic that he had that came out today or yesterday, arguing essentially that the Republican Party is not going to become two parties, right? So a lot of times people say, oh, is Trump going to create his own party, and is that going to, fracture off? And Noel says it much better than I can. But essentially, that's not going to happen, right? What we're going to have is a battle for the Republican Party. And when I'm looking not at some new party, call it the Patriot Party, call it whatever you want. And so where I'm watching that, there's, of course, a whole lot of freshman members of Congress. There's kind of 5 that I'm sort of keeping an eye on that, I think 3 of them are on one side of this chasm and 2 are on the other. So somebody mentioned Madison Cawthorn, of course, from North Carolina, Lauren Boebert from Colorado, and then Marjorie Taylor Greene from Georgia. On the sort of one side, the very Trump side, the shatter norms side. And then on the other side, a Nancy Mace and a Peter Meyer. So Nancy Mace, of course, from South Carolina. She beat Joe Cunningham in this Charleston district, and Peter Meyer from Michigan. Now, ideologically, we'll see when they start casting votes. My gut is they're probably going to look pretty similar. So political scientists tend to use this measure called nominate scores that are now out, I think, at UCLA, and there's a website you can look those up and see kind of where every member of Congress' voting pattern holds. My bet is that all 5 of those folks will probably have pretty similar voting patterns, but their rhetoric is radically different. And all 5 of those are people who have drawn attention based on their position relative to the party, right? So Nancy Mace was on Meet the Press, I believe, her first week in Congress. I cannot turn on my TV without seeing Madison Cawthorn or Boebert or Marjorie Taylor Greene, for that matter. And Peter Meyer has made such a name for himself in Michigan that he already has a primary opponent 2 years from now. So I think the future of the Republican Party, maybe the lens that we should be looking at it through, the tea leaves we should be reading, are which side of that 5-person divide wins.
Susan, how do you see the divide within the Republican Party playing itself out?
Well, I mean, to me, it is unfortunate. There was a CNN poll that was taken, I think, the 9th through the 14th. So we've got January 6th, post-January 6th. Yeah. And 75% of Republicans do not think that Biden rightfully won for the presidency. And I think all the things we've been talking about, you grease the oil of the institutions with legitimacy and trust. And if we have that many Republicans who do not believe, or at least, that Joe Biden is not legitimately the president, and you throw in there impeachment and insurrection, it doesn't bode well for things moving along. And so I think that the Republican Party is, they've got to, this is, an obvious thing, they've got to deal with Trump. And I don't know whether or not there might be a sigh of relief if Trump is convicted of his impeachment and cannot, seek office again. I mean, there might be some Republicans that go to, because, they're chasing that electoral, that win. And I think that's a real problem for the Republican Party.
Wendy, how do you see this playing out in terms of, you've talked about polarization, the intensity of it. Is this just going to make matters worse?
Well, so I was actually reading an article that was just published in APSR in April of last year. And APSR is American Political Science Review. It's one of our top journals. And I want to give credit to the authors. They are Graham and Sfolik. And they wrote about democracy versus partisanship. And they did an experiment where they asked people to which candidate they would vote for in a totally blind, comparison. So would you vote for the person who is closest to your political beliefs, like pick a candidate? And then they gave one of the candidates an anti-democratic proposition. So I think that the election should be thrown out if I don't win. Or I think that reporters should be punished if they publish critiques of a candidate. And they were trying to test and see if people would stick with their preferred candidate if that candidate expressed anti-democratic views. So are they testing like how committed are Americans to democracy? It was not good news. The Americans generally still preferred the person who was closest to their partisanship than, and they didn't really mind if they expressed anti-democratic views. And so to answer your question, Michael, about moving forward, it motivates me to get more civics education everywhere. And I think maybe the people who were answering didn't understand that what they were hearing was anti-democratic views. To hear someone say, like, we shouldn't be shutting down reporters if they critique the leaders. In fact, that's actually a very good thing. It's an important part of a democracy. Do most people know that? I don't know. And so, I know that. I teach that in my Intro to American class, but not everybody takes that class. So I think that on the one hand, it doesn't look good right now in this hyper-partisan era. But I also think that we have tools that we can use to get out of this. The United States swings from hyper-partisan to less partisan in cycles. We need to survive the cycle. And one way that we can do that is by, civic education, but also remembering, and this is where I'm kind of hopeful about the pandemic, remembering that we're all humans and, we're all facing similar problems. That COVID doesn't care if you're a Democrat or Republican. And so trying to get back to those kinds of values, I think, is really important and would hopefully help us edge back from sliding away from democracy.
Yeah, it's going to take a lot of work, and I'm curious as to whether folks are willing to invest themselves in the kind of work that needs to be done, not just on civic values. I mean, I think we all teach Intro to American Government. We teach the basic principles, but there's also the values that oftentimes we talk about what it means to be an American. And it has felt like to me we have moved beyond the partisan divide to a divide of, well, you're not really as much of an American as I am. And that to me just is even more alarm bells and red lights going off to say we need some commonality of basic principles that this democratic republic is founded on, because if we can't agree on those, what is there to agree on? I don't know if anybody wants, I don't know if we want to end on that kind of a Debbie Downer, but save me from myself, Susan or Chris.
One of the most meaningful things in the inaugural ceremony was the song, "This land is your land, this land is my land." Yeah. And that was so, that was encouraging to me. I think that if we played that again and we listened to that and people really said, well, we have differences, but maybe this is still our land. And you've got to, go through and maybe redefine the American dream. So I think it's going to be a challenge, but I like that song and I like the inauguration.
I mean, I don't know that I'm definitely not going to disagree with any Woody Guthrie tune that anybody wants to put out there. So I'm like, you're good there. And Michael, I don't think I'm going to save you from yourself. I mean, I hope that we can kind of regain these democratic norms. I do. I think the paper that Whitney talked about and described is scary. I think other papers that folks have been doing about corrections scare me, right? So that if you correct somebody's misinformation, they actually hold to that original piece of information even more strongly. There was another recent paper that just came out in Science arguing that we've moved from polarization to sectarianism, right? The notion that it's so bad we have to create another word for it, or at least apply another word for it, right? It's not just I disagree with you about politics, but I really don't like you, right? So they argue that that is not applicable to anyone watching or on the screen right now, by the way. That is a rhetorical statement. But but that sectarianism is about othering, aversion, and moralization, right? Yeah. So the idea that it is moved into something different. And people are doing really interesting studies about this, and they'll show that now, if you put up your partisanship on a dating website, that will sort of drive who is willing to even be interested in dating you on Match.com or whatever the kids are using these days. So, I don't know. How do we get out of this spiral? I mean, one, it's going to take people saying it's enough. And I don't know how to get people to do that. But I think we're watching right now, the Democratic Party, sometimes come back at the Republican Party with similar things and say, look, well, the Republican Party did this before. It's okay that we're using this similar language now. Or the Republican Party saying, hey, look, they said this about Trump. Now we're going to say this about Biden. And so to some degree, it's about, just deciding that enough is enough. And I don't know what institutional levers we need to pull to make that happen. But I think that's what we need to be in search of. Maybe it is civics education, as Whitney talked about. Maybe it is reminding folks of the reason why we engage in governance in the first place.
Yeah, because ultimately, it's, as I'm sure Whitney does when she teaches con law, the first three words of the Constitution's preamble: we the people. And we have gotten ourselves into this. There's a lot of blame, I would dare say, to go around from elected leaders down to the grassroots, but it's ultimately we the people need to figure this out and fundamentally decide which way we want to go. But there is hope. I think I speak for everybody here that we are teachers and instructors of this, but we are also citizens. And we hope that, with a new year comes a new dynamic. We'll just have to wait and see how it all plays out. But we will certainly be coming back to this venue, and want to thank everybody for watching the inaugural 2021 vlog of Old North State Politics, and hope everyone is having a safe and well new year, and we will see folks soon. Thanks again.